Good evening, everyone. Um, and thank you for joining us tonight for the virtual screening and panel discussion of the film Bad Hombres. My name is Sheila Martinez, and I am the president of MetroLALSA, a student organization run by 13 member law schools in the New York and New Jersey area, which works to provide a network for all our student members. We're glad to be able to host this event and along with our co-sponsors, Latinojustice, an organization that works to create a more just society by using and challenging the rule of law to secure transformative, equitable, and accessible justice by empowering our community and by fostering leadership through advocacy and education. I would like to give a special thank you to our Seton Hall delegate, Devin Weber, who put this event together for us tonight. And I would like to remind you that after the screening of the film, we will have a panel discussion, so make sure you stay tuned. It will be moderated by Seton Hall professor Solange Maldonado, and it will be a discussion with our guest speakers, Jorge Renaud, Jack Quiles, Aníbal Lebron, and Carlos Sandoval. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy tonight's film.
My father was gunned down by Bakersfield PD, 73-year-old suffering from dementia, early stages of dementia. He probably wasn't even doing anything, just taking his walk so he can try to rest. I ain't got nothing against the police, but this needs to stop against innocent people. Enough is enough already.
Look your hands! Look at your hands! We have 311 shots fired! Shots fired!
Ruben, Policia, Manos! Manos!
Drop the gun! Drop the gun! Do it now! Drop the gun!
Luis, are you okay? You all 5 men! 5 men! Papa! Is he okay? He doesn't move!
Ven para acá. Va, ven acá. Ma!
Colonialization, racial dominance, the notion that there is a superior race in the United States has everything to do with control of a particular population.
When it comes to the criminal justice system, Latino stereotypes tend to focus on certain types of criminality. And these are long-standing historical narratives that have been created since at least the mid-1800s. Mexicans, Latin Americans generally, were looked at as an inferior race. That helped justify the conquest of half of Mexico by 1848. It certainly was part of what the United States designs on expanding westward. We're all about.
When the U.S.-Mexican War ended in 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, one of the key provisions was that Mexicans living on now United States side would be able to choose U.S. citizenship if they wished, and then to have their property rights maintained. But no matter what the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said, many whites believed that they had won the war and Mexicans no longer had any claim or right to California. So they felt completely justified in posting notices that said all Mexicans, all Latinos, Chileans, Peruvians, any other Spanish speakers in the mines have 24 hours to leave, and if they didn't, they would be killed.
Anglo-Americans wanted access to Mexicans and indigenous peoples' land, and one of the principal ways to do that was to eliminate them, either by outright killings or by criminalizing them and making them outsiders in a community that they had long before actually dominated.
In the middle of the 19th century, Mexicans who were extra-legally killed by lynch mobs or Texas Rangers or vigilantes, it's certainly in the thousands. One of the things that led to the Mexican lynchings being forgotten is that they divided the victims into just two categories, black and white. And in that white category were Native Americans, Chinese, and more than anyone else, Mexicans.
Making one group of humans to be separate and apart and lesser than is a project of racialization.
Spanish-American War, which resulted in the acquisition of a handful of territories within the Caribbean Sea and also in the Pacific Islands. Puerto Rico especially became a target for this acquisition.
Puerto Ricans are second largest population in the United States today of Latinos, and that's a population that has been under U.S. domination since 1898.
Many Puerto Ricans, by way of United States policies and economic policies that the United States fostered and promoted, migrated out of Puerto Rico into the 50 states. And they migrated here under incredible hard conditions. I'm a Puerto Rican man in the United States. I was picked up by the police twice. I remembered what it felt like having my nephew watch me being stopped for no justification. Damn it, I had shorts on, sneakers, tank top, a basketball under my arm. I had just eaten bacalao. You know what bacalao is? Bacalao is like pungent with onions, and they claimed I was smoking pot on a street corner. That's why they stopped me. The stereotypes, the profiling, really like the excessive policing that exists in urban America exists in so many ways, and the devastation stayed with me forever.
Puerto Ricans have this distinct experience of being colonized by the United States and also citizens of the United States, where immigration is not as central to their experience in being here. And thinking about other Latin Americans that are coming to the United States, where immigration is the issue that they face the most. Those two distinct identities really shapes people's experiences. And I think part of that is what we're seeing and how it's shaping the larger narrative within the United States, that there's this idea that criminal justice is not as central to the Latinx experience, which is unequivocally false, right? Because part of the way that immigration comes into place largely is through criminalization.
During the 1920s, Mexicans made more than 1 million border crossings into the United States. The Mexican population of the United States by 1930 was about 10% of the entire population of Mexico, about 1.5 million people. The National Origins Act of 1924. It's effectively a whites-only immigration law that restricts about 96% of the open quota spots to Europeans. But there's employers across the western United States who are saying, we need access to Mexican workers. If you prohibit Mexican workers from coming into the country, what are we going to do with our farms? What are we going to do with our railroads? Who's going to take care of our children? All of that. So they build in an exemption that Mexicans can come and go, enter and exit the country, largely at will. But what starts happening during the 1920s is that it's not that Mexicans are coming and going out of the country, it's that they're settling down in the United States and they're becoming Mexican Americans. And this creates a new crisis for the white settler state. We never intended for Mexican immigrants to stay. We intended them to come, pick, and go. So they do come to one compromise, is the Immigration Act of 1929. This was a law that was created to target Mexican immigrants in particular, to make sure that they went through the official ports of entry and got permission to come into the country, so that permission could be revoked at any time. We didn't want to have so many Mexicans here. And if they cross the border unmonitored, they're going to be criminalized. They're going to be turned into felons. Immediately after the passage of this new law, the number of Mexicans being imprisoned in the United States began to skyrocket. By the end of the 1930s, about 44,000 Mexicans had been arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. This was the first surge of Mexican incarceration in the United States and had everything to do with immigration control. And here in the United States, incarceration is one of the leading, strongest pillars of the settler state. It functions to remove people from the land, to cage them up, and in fact, to eliminate them from the social order.
We have something like 2.3 million people incarcerated in cages in the U.S. I want people to understand that when you put someone in jail or prison, you put them in a cage. A cage is made of iron, it rusts, it's made of steel, it clangs, and that's what we do to animals. Part of that is taking away the simple freedoms, keeping your hair the way you want it, not having any personal expression when it comes to facial hair or hair, having them all wear the same clothes, making them stand a certain way when they address a guard, right, your hands behind your back, always adopting a subservient pose. Prison is long, long periods of lonely despair, interspersed or broken up by Mary B's small seconds of terror. What it is you get dehumanized. It's just a constant wearing down of the individual. You end up questioning yourself, telling yourself, I deserve this. I am the piece of shit that they're telling me I am. And that ends up transferring itself to whatever interactions you have when you get out. And you have to constantly fight that. I was born in the Panhandle of Texas. My father was a farmer. My childhood was a normal Chicano Mexican-American childhood, right? Living in the fields with my family, working la cosecha, going to school, fighting with the white folks, you know, that kind of stuff. Until I turned about 15 or 16, then things kind of changed. One of the things that I just started admitting to in the last few years, I wondered what set me on this path, was the fact that before I went to prison the first time, I was thrown in jail for drinking while DWI, back when it was legal, actually, driving while drinking. And I mouthed off to the cop, and I was thrown into a county jail, into a tank full of men, grown men who'd been convicted and were waiting to go to prison as opposed to city jail. I was raped pretty brutally all night. They let me go the next day, and 2 weeks later, I walked into a fast food joint and robbed it in this Odyssey in prison. It took me a long time to come to terms with that.
The country's insatiable appetite to continue to punish people is also a form of social control. And social control exists for multiple reasons, not the least of which is to marginalize people, not the least of which is to actually control their behavior.
In 1855, California enacted what is called the Greaser Act. This law was a way of racially profiling Mexicans, people of Latin American origin, in ways that allowed law enforcement to control that population.
racial profiling itself is inherently reflective of what people's perceptions are of Latinos in general.
Hollywood films pushed this idea that Latinos were a criminally prone population. This idea of the bandido, the criminal Mexican, was also part of the narrative that these people who were resisting and in their own communities were trying to maintain their own land and territory and property, that these were criminal elements. Very similar to how Native Americans were looked at as fierce savages.
What Hollywood's done is to reduce an entire culture to one thing: criminality.
In the city of Los Angeles, by the 1940s, young Mexican-American wore zoot suits. There was a way of trying to find their own sense of self and identity at a time when they were marginalized in a city that was once part of Mexico. And it was difficult for them to even walk from downtown into white neighborhoods, white areas of town.
People choose to dress in distinctive ways because it's a countercultural movement. Is to show that they're no longer invisible. When kids themselves feel like they have no self-identity in the community because it's stigmatized, it's demonized, they're gonna still wear it as a form of rebellion. Because if society doesn't care about them, they're not gonna compromise their identity to make them happy. They're not. They're already marginal themselves. They don't even have to wear clothes. Their colors of their skins, their haircuts, their walk, their nonverbal communication, all these cues are also gonna be used against them as them being gang members.
In many ways, that trajectory between bandidos and that stereotype, vagrancy laws that happened in California, the way the entire Zoot Suit riots actually occurred as a way to protect the community from abuse from, in that case, naval forces who are on leave. All these issues feed into a bigger stereotype of criminality among all of us.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Right after Nixon declares the first iteration of the war on drugs,
with the signing of this
in
bill,
New York, Nelson Rockefeller created these mandatory minimums for drug possession, the Rockefeller drug laws, which carried 12 to life sentences for simple drug possession.
The new law is tough. There will be no reduced or suspended sentences, and persons serving less than a life term will get no parole.
People don't realize that when we talk about drugs and we talk about drug wars, they've always been targeted against people that were not white.
we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
Fast forward 30 years later, we're seeing 30, 40, 45,000 arrests every year. One year, there were more people that got arrested for marijuana possession in 2010, 2011 than could fit in all of Yankee Stadium. 86% Black and Latino.
The studies are showing, and have been showing consistently over time, that Latinos use illicit drugs and other substances at much lower rates than whites in the United States.
We can go back and forth about drug laws if they're neutral. We cannot deny that drug enforcement is never neutral and is based on disrupting and controlling communities of color.
The war on drugs, it's a war on Latinas, Latinos, it's a war on people of color, it's a war on immigrants. But we cannot divorce what's happening in the United States, what's happening in the entire hemisphere. The war on drugs in the United States is also a war on our gente in Central America.
México es el rey del opio.
On our pueblos of Sudamerica. There are people in incredible towns throughout the Caribbean.
Entre 2006 y 2017 murieron 330,000 personas en México por la guerra contra la droga. Colombia es el rey de la cocaína.
Think about places like Colombia and Mexico and seeing the ridiculously high death tolls associated with drug-related violence. The conversation that is missing is the United States export of drug prohibition and how that has created all this violence, which has influenced the forced migration patterns out of Latin America into the United States.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
There is a long-standing myth that immigrants come into this country to commit crime. But the data over time show that immigrants actually tend to have lower rates of incarceration, lower rates of crime than other groups and U.S.-born citizens.
We know that when you look at the statistics, the research, it shows that people of color are more likely going to be targeted to go into prison. We already know that's the design. That's a fact. I've been pulled over by the police at my university. They look at my embodiment. They look at my presentation of self. They look at my tattoos. They look at the way I dress. And I could have a PhD, a JD, or MD. As long as I look like I do, I'm still going to be called a gang member. And it's funny because when you ask me where I'm from, like, I'll tell you exactly where I'm from. What you're asking me, what gang I'm from? Well, let me answer that. You see those buildings over there? I hang out with 3 or more people. We all coexist in a department. It's called the Department of Sociology. So by definition, yeah, I am a gang member.
The country views all people in the same way, with that quick association of stereotype, that almost like Pavlovian response. You see a Mexicano, he's got to be in a gang. You see a Puerto Rican man, he's got to be in a gang. Today, you see a Salvadoreño, a person from El Salvador, that person has to be in a gang. The gang is MS-13. Those associations are quick to be made, and they become part of an unconscious perception by most America that we are here to commit crime. And that feeds into law enforcement and criminal justice system's problems.
There have been that long narrative of Latino youth being engaged in gang activity, and gang activity in and of itself is oftentimes viewed as a criminal organization. But you can be a gang member but not necessarily being engaged in criminal activity.
We're not like everybody else, you know. That's what was different about us. That we're like the different ones, you know. They're like, look at them, you know, look at their hair.
Young people being loud, young people gathering in large numbers does not necessarily rise to the level of criminality.
The problem here is that the stereotype of a few or a handful that gets put upon an entire race of people.
gang injunction is an extension of the prison system onto the streets.
What they do is that it gives permission to local law enforcement to go into this neighborhood that's already deemed problematic and has an injunction, so that there's like this annotation that it's dangerous, and they can come and question anybody in the neighborhood.
So people that say that it's not a big deal to have gang injunctions, it is a big deal when it's destroying families, when the whole community is seen as suspect, when there's 24/7 surveillance on the community.
Gang injunctions are like a blanket put on a neighborhood. Anybody in that community can be a target, and it's excused because they're suspected to be gang members. So it really gives law enforcement this excessive amount of power and excuse to violate somebody's constitutional rights. When my hometown, Santa Barbara, got hit with a gang injunction, we had to fight it through a legal avenue, through public opinion, through the media, and then through community organizing. So empowering the community to stand up and say, no, we don't need this. And after 4 years of fighting that injunction, amazing community members, families, and the legal team, that injunction was defeated. So it was won. It was won at the state level. By the time I was 12, I got into a fight at my middle school, and I was charged for assault. And I got on probation when I was 12 years old. I saw myself as a troubled person. I often ask, why can't I just follow the rules? Or why am I so angry? Within those years that I was on probation, I had a social worker assigned to my case at the age of 12. So she was very understanding and was so supportive of my family, not just me, but my mother. And I had a probation officer that was very invested in providing services to get me out of the system, not to keep me stuck in the system and this revolving door. And so I wanted to ensure that the services that were provided to me, the support that was provided to me, that I was able to pay that forward to somebody else. Not just one-on-one, but also like looking at it in a systemic and policy frame.
It is not just simply that the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the entire world, but it's that African Americans, along with Latinos, now make up the population that is subject to mass incarceration.
The police enacted broken windows policing. They used stop and frisk. They increased their interactions with people, specifically communities of color.
The policy of stop, question, and frisk allows police officers to stop and search anyone acting suspiciously.
And the way stop and frisk was enforced was that they primarily focused on Black and Latino people.
Between 2004 and 2012, there were 4.43 million stops. 52% were Black suspects, 31% were Hispanic.
And so if the kid had a baggie in their pocket, which in their pocket is a $100 ticket, in the course of a stop and frisk arrest, once they pull out that marijuana and put it in plain view, that is an arrestable misdemeanor. And you have nearly 800,000 people that have been arrested for simple marijuana possession just in New York City in the last 20 years. You don't get to mass incarceration without there being a policy said or unsaid that includes racial profiling.
You could get these young officers who think my job is to just throw people in jail. They're a bad guy that committed a crime, I throw them in jail. That's my part. Let the courts take care of the rest. Let the prison system figure it out. That's not my job as a cop, but it's much more complex than that.
If we want to break through issues of implicit bias in the police force, there's got to be a better way to think about relating to the community and protecting that community and engaging in legitimate law enforcement activities that does not perceive communities as being criminally prone and engaged in criminal conduct as a starting point.
You know, police officers go to certain neighborhoods and break up underage drinking and call parents, or they go to parties that have underage drinking and they arrest kids. So how do we work with law enforcement to do more of the former than the latter? And how do we make sure that the former is expanded to communities that look like you and me?
I really do think that you can change people's implicit biases that they're not even aware of through them interacting and collaborating with those communities. I think that's how people develop the cultural competency and put away those stereotypes that maybe they were brought up. But until you feel it here, you know, in the corazón, this is where the change is in the heart.
When I first got out into our communities back from Dominguez State Jail, I was just naive to what the real impact was going to be until I actually began going out there and looking for work, looking to see how I can make a living, how I can support my child who was 3 years old, Nicholas. You know, all these things, and I wasn't able to. I was struggling. I couldn't even get a Happy Meal at McDonald's, so you know that was a big problem for me, and so I was devastated.
To me, if somebody's done their time, we gotta forgive them on the back end. And if that's not the right thing to do, then we as a community, as a society, need to change our laws and say, well, we're not going to forgive you, and call it what it is, right? We're going to punish you, and we feel that it's punishment. And don't call it rehabilitation if it's not really that.
I'm a self-educated man. Ever since I was a child, even when I was homeless, my friends knew me as the professor. So, you know, learning data, I pretty much learned from YouTube University, all right? So they're there. And also going to the library and learning to how to data mine and do all kinds of stuff. So I taught myself, but I needed to figure out, okay, what do I really want to do with this? And what is it really, how do I use this? So I played with it and played with it and played with it. And while I was playing with it, I didn't realize I was actually developing it.
In the United States criminal justice systems, it's very, very frequent for states to only report out how many people are arrested or imprisoned, on parole, on probation, only in black and white and other. They consistently count Latinos as whites. And until we finally fix this data problem, we can't have a full appreciation of how these systems actually hurt Latino populations.
We began collecting data, criminal justice history, voter information. We began data mining, and we figured out that we had almost 100,000 justice-impacted voters in San Antonio already. We also found out that about 57,000 to 63,000 were active voters. So we started breaking these down by ages, we started breaking it down by gender, in order to study the demographics of the voting patterns of justice-impacted people. Organizing criminal justice as a Latino isn't easy because our voice isn't as loud as others. Our historical struggles are not considered to be a part of the discussion. And a lot of times you put a lot of effort and energy showing up to these policy meetings and advocating and visiting people, and you feel like nothing's happening. One time, I was at the point where I was gonna just give up. But you want someone to be strong, and you want someone not to give up, and you want something to be a leader, then you have got to be those things too. And sometimes we get to the point where we're just like, enough's enough, I'm tired of it. But that's the test. That We don't give up. So I don't give up.
No peace, no more killers! Police! Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets! What do we want? Justice!
How do we change the culture of a punishment industry? We can't do it by ourselves as Latinas and Latinos, nor can the Black community do it by itself. It needs the incredible solidarity among all groups that actually experience the magnitude of imprisonment in the United States.
I want people to understand that it's something systemic that we gotta fight against. We gotta abolish all prisons, especially when we know that that justice means just us, that we gotta change that.
We need to change, or we're going to just continue making the same mistakes we've had in the past. We just got to start listening to each other.
But we cannot allow this discussion to be limited in a way that completely erases decades of policies that were directed against Latinos because of who we are.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion portion of the program. We encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A, and I will be looking for those in a few minutes. We have a raffle going on, so be sure to stay with us to be eligible for the drawing. So I am delighted to be here tonight, and I have the privilege of introducing our panelists. So first, we have Carlos Sandoval, the filmmaker and the director of Bad Hombres, Decolonization and Criminalization. Mr. Sandoval is an Emmy-nominated and Sundance Award-winning filmmaker of 3 documentaries that should be on your must-watch list. So The State of Arizona, which focuses on Arizona's immigration law, SB 107, A Class Apart, which I have to say is, well, one of my favorites between Bad Hombres and Class Apart. I'm not sure, but another, definitely a top film. It's about the Mexican-American civil rights story. And then the other film, which you must also watch, is Farmingdale, which deals with illegal immigration. Mr. Sandoval's work is informed by his legal training, as well as his experience on refugee and immigration policy, including as a member of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations. He teaches at the Columbia School of Journalism. He serves on several film boards, and he writes a monthly column for the Express News Group. I am also joined by my colleague next door at Rutgers Law School, Aníbal Rosario Lebron. Mr. Rosario Lebron is a Puerto Rican lawyer, law professor, linguist, and a photographer. He holds an LLM in legal theory from NYU University and earned his JD, postgraduate certificate in linguistics, and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Puerto Rico. Before joining Rutgers, he taught at Howard University, University of Louisville in Kentucky, and also at Hofstra. And he has also taught at Universidad de Puerto Rico and Universidad Interamericana. His research examines the interconnection between evidence, family law, criminal law, and constitutional law from a cross-disciplinary lens. And specifically, he studies how to reform the law to empower women, people of color, and LGBTQ people and minors, among other groups, in their pursuit of equality. We are also joined by Jack Quiles Noyar, a senior program associate with the Reshaping Prosecution Program at the Vera Institute for Justice, working with elected prosecutors across the country to end mass incarceration, address racial disparities, and make prosecutors' offices more accountable to the communities that they serve. Prior to joining the Vera Institute, Mex Quiles Noyar served as an investigative attorney in the Office of the Inspector General for the New York City Police Department and the New York City Department of Investigations, where they independently oversaw and investigated policies and practices of the NYPD. And prior to that, Mex Quiles was a prosecutor at the Kings County District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. And there they created an office-wide policy that the district attorney adopted to decrease the harms caused to the LGBTQ plus community by the criminal legal system. Mex Quiles is currently the deputy president of the Hispanic National Bar Association, Region 2, representing New York City. And last but not least, we are joined by Jorge Renau, the regional director of the policy and advocacy at Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. Mr. Renau is the author of numerous studies that examine how to address mass incarceration and disproportionate sentencing. As a policy analyst at the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, he drafted dozens of bills addressing prison conditions and parole supervision in Texas. He is a published poet, a veteran, and a proud father. And as you just saw from his feature in the film, he was previously incarcerated for several decades, and he often speaks at events addressing the criminal justice system and Latinx communities. So welcome to all. Just a reminder, I'm going to start with a few questions, but I look forward to seeing many of your questions on the Q&A in just a few minutes. So first I want to start by thanking Carlos, Mr. Sandoval, for making this powerful film and making this history available to everyone. And so, the first thing I would like to hear, to learn a little bit more about is, Bad Hombres is the first film in a 7-part documentary series titled Decolonize Justice. So, Mr. Sandoval, why did you decide to make this documentary series? I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thanks for your kind words. Before I answer your question, though, I also want to thank you for making this screening possible, as well as Devin Weber. These things don't get done by themselves. They require a dedication, persistence. Devin's been at work on this for about 2 or 3 months. So my thank you, Devin, for all your work. I also want to thank all the panelists that are here, because buried in my answer is the kind of work and dedication and the hunger, thirst for this material that we all share. And I think the need to elevate this issue and get it out there. This project, all these films are really the result of Latino Justice and their vision. Latino Justice, a few years ago, the then executive director, Juan Cartagena, who you see in the film, as well as the great, sadly late John Garcia, who was with Latino Justice, had this idea of trying to elevate the question of Latinos in the criminal justice system, and wondered how to do it. I think initial impulse for them was that we tend to sort of conceptually divide things, and I think within our hearts and souls also divide them, and that we as Latinos have not really participated that much in this question of criminal justice, so we're significantly impacted by it. We tend to see it as the realm of the African American experience and the work that's been done there. We have sort of been categorized and I think put ourselves more in the category of immigration as a policy issue. Latino Justice felt a need to really get involved with this question, to bury it deeper, to start these conversations, and they decided to do this in a way that I thought was quite innovative, which is to do it by film. They understood that policy is one thing, to get at motivating people is another. So narrative can have an impact that a dry paper might not have. So Latino Justice commissioned my film to be the sort of table setter, and that's why it's so dense and why we go into so much history, because there's not been much on this subject. So just to get people try to get people up to speed a little bit on the issue became the purpose of my film. Um, there are also several other films that include shorts. They're about 7 minutes, 7 to 12 minutes each, by a fantastic array of young emerging Latinx filmmakers. They include one on police brutality, another on reentry, another on racial profiling, as well as Latino data gap, immigration, and on gangs. And if we could, I would really appreciate if we could put up in the crawl a link to the site where you can catch these films at your leisure, and I really commend them to you. So again, thank you.
Thank you. And so you just gave us a lot there, and I'm hoping we're going to explore some of these themes throughout our conversation. But I want to pick up with, I think, sort of the first point that you made, which is that Latinos, we really haven't been part of this conversation in terms of criminal justice. And so, I mean, the film premiered in January 2020. Pre-COVID, everything in our lives these days is pre-COVID or during COVID or hopefully post-COVID. But this was prior to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And since then, we have seen a significant increase in discussions about interactions between law enforcement and communities of color. But my sense, and I think you just sort of confirmed that, is that when we think about abuses by law enforcement, when we think about mass incarceration, when we think about criminalization of people of color, most of us think primarily or exclusively about African Americans, but we don't think about Latinos. In a sense, it's as if the Latinos have been, we are los olvidados, which Juan Perea, he's a civil rights attorney, law professor, he writes how Latinos are olvidados. We are the forgotten ones in discussions about racial inequality and injustice. But in the film, Juan Cartagena points out that one reason for this invisibility is the lack of data collection and the fact that Latinos have historically been counted as white, thereby rendering Afro-Latinos invisible when we talk about criminal justice. So I would like, for anyone on the panel who would really like to sort of start this conversation, why do you think it is that Latinos have not been seen as part of the criminal justice reform conversation? Why is police brutality seen primarily as an African American issue and not a Latino issue? And how can we change this? What is our role in the fight against criminal injustice? And what can we do to make sure that the mistreatment and marginalization of Latinos is part of the public conversation? So who wants to take that on?
Well, that's a huge thing. I'm going to take the first part and let Jack and Aníbal and Carlos take the other three. Why are we not? It's because of us, mostly. Because we see criminality as a personal dysfunction. Eres marihuano, eres puta, there's something wrong with you. That's why you're caught up in that system, right? We have, unlike the African American community that has to talk with their kids, and anytime you can hit the street, you can be disemboweled, you can have your head cut off, you can be jailed by the agents of social control, right? We don't say that to our kids. We say, no te juntes con aquel. And again, it's by and large. I'm not saying all of us, right? Some of us may have had that. I don't know. And then you go back to the national organizations comprised of Latinos, right? And I'm not going to name names here, but there's only two of them that I know of that have had actual divisions devoted to CJ. They've had them devoted to immigration, to education, to voting rights, right? But, they haven't had anything saying, well, look, there is a system out there that not only is colonizing you, but it's dehumanizing you and it's putting you in jail and putting you in prison, right? How many of the people watching here have, un tío fungano or somebody, que está encarcelado, and we say, oh, he's in Japan, or he's in California, right? Tu tío donde está? We don't say that, right? So, yeah, the media, whatever, we can point fingers all we want to about the media sees us as white, whatever, but we're thugs.
I mean, if you look at Hollywood portrayals of us, we are seen as criminals. We have somehow not, or we have just made the conscious decision to do the Indio thing. Aguantate, this too shall pass. Don't lift your head up too high because it'll get it chopped off. And if you get in trouble with the law, aguantate way. Right? We do not welcome back into our communities people who have been incarcerated and coming out and getting into CJ reform. I'm one of the very few CJ organizers who's a Chicano in this country. It's a black-white binary because we don't welcome them back.
Mm-hmm.
So y'all take the other parts. I think that.
Anibal, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jorge that it has to do with part of the shame, but it also has to do with part of the racism within the community as well, right? And the idea that sometimes, and it's also reflected in how people are counted, like we think of Latinos as non-Black or non-people of color or their own category, right? So creating that divide makes that part of how we see ourselves and the narrative that we want to put out there, right? And the idea of we need to assimilate into the country. And if we portray ourselves as people of color, as people who are part of the criminal system, we want to assimilate into the system. So that's part of what is going on. And also, I think part of what has been left in terms of organizing is that we think about the criminal system as this little piece, and we don't see that the carceral state, the criminal system goes beyond the criminal and all these facts. And we have the family system that is also criminalizing Latinos and Latinas. And we also have the education system, which is also criminalizing Latinas and Latinos and Latinx people. So that's part of what I think it's creating that divide, and that we haven't seen that response from our community.
I want to pick up on those themes a little bit later more, sort of the different sort of police systems, the different sort of justice systems, policing systems. But I want to give Jack an opportunity to chime in as well on this question.
Yeah, thanks so much. Before I go, I also wanted to say that I really appreciate that this space was created. I was involved in MetroLALSA years ago when I was in law school. It is an incredibly important space, and we were connected to Latino justice like right away as a law student, and that's provided me like incredible support. And it's connected because there is not enough representation, and I'm not the one, if anybody knows me, I'm far from the one that makes the representational sort of politics argument, but I will say that the lack of involvement, like Jorge had mentioned, of Latinos in criminal justice policy work. There is a lot of lack of education around the ways in which American foreign policy, which we can get into, is connected to the criminal legal system and feeds into the criminal legal system as part of the American settler colonial project. That, you know, if with Latinos, because we all come from different, you know, countries, me being Puerto Rican, you know, a lot of times our communities don't see the different parts of our community, like don't see how we're related to others. The term Latino has been imposed on us by the United States, right? So in terms of us seeing each other as like a holistic community is already a barrier. A lot of our people also come here from other countries that have very different legal systems. So oftentimes as a prosecutor, I was giving a lot of this as political education to our people when I would have, you know, survivors of crime coming into my office and all they spoke was Spanish. Professor Lebron, you'd be proud to hear that I like looked up, you know, how do I translate concepts like bail, and how do we explain to community members from countries that had a civil legal system that don't have like a legal system the way that we do. A lot of it is based on civil code. So there's just a lot of lack of education around just American foreign policy, how the system works, what our shared histories are. And I think that's all purposeful. Like it's not a part of the American public education to talk about, you know, the ways in which, and you know, that's what I love so much about Carlos's film, because it really made that connection about the war on drugs and the American foreign policy in South America. So I would say the lack of education and lack of representation of us in spaces of criminal legal reform that weren't the ones who kind of just, kept our noses in a book and allowed the American legal system to, kind of like brainwash us into accepting half-made reforms and really like being willing to challenge it.
I mean, one of the things, there's so much there, so much that you've all given me to think about, but when you talked about reform, it reminded me that it seemed briefly during COVID, at the start of COVID, or specifically after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, that maybe we were going to start seeing some reform. At least maybe I'm just, optimist, eternal optimist. So I thought we were really going to see some criminal justice reform. And yet what we are seeing, like last week, 2 weeks ago, is that we are now seeing a backlash, right, to any type of criminal justice reform. And this seems, I guess I'm just, very shocked so soon after the racial reckoning of 2020. But just as a few examples, right? We've seen a rejection of bail reform in New York, for example, and across the country, we see that Republicans are looking to repeal or prevent any type of criminal justice reforms, even though these are the reforms that would, some of these reforms have led to a decrease in racial profiling, and now we're actually sort of going to bring it back and increase racial profiling, and put more people in prison, in jail, because they cannot post bail, and all the other collateral consequences that we're going to talk about. Indeed, the Marshall Project actually has on their website, they have a page, and the title is "Backlash on Reform Due to Concerns About Crime." So it's almost as if some of the increase in crime, that has been relatively recent, like that has given people an excuse to say, oh, well, criminal justice reform, that just cannot work. How do we respond to this backlash?
I don't know that I have the answer to how we respond to it. I do firmly believe it exists. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to make certain that we don't go back to where we were. My sense is that this country tends to, we tend as a country to whipsaw back and forth, don't we? There was this, as you pointed out, Solange, after George Floyd, there was this great forward movement towards reform, but it sort of se estancó, and now it's really falling back. And I think that what we're getting now is more of a return, not just we're no longer just holding on. I think we're going backwards again. And I think that the only remedy that I can think of is, this is part of that remedy, right? Getting together tonight, discussing this, becoming aware, being vigilant, and realizing that that while people are concerned and talking about a rise in crime rates, look at the reality of the numbers and try to speak to them where we can, to understand the nature of the fear and acknowledge that, but at the same time say, what is really behind that? Is it about race? Is it about ethnicity? What do you begin to unpack that a little bit? But I think awareness is part of that process.
If I could jump in for a minute, I don't know if there was actually a movement toward criminal justice reform. I think there was a movement toward reform of the police. I think the police were singled out as purveyors of violence against individuals of color. And there was a huge backlash, and there was all these defund the police movement. But criminal justice reform would have taken the form of across the spectrum: prison oversight, probation and parole changes, all these other things that actually have been. We've all been in this arena for a minute, I think. I've been, CJ for a minute, and I've seen the incremental changes. I've seen Exit in New York, right? The Executive Transforming Parole and Probation, pushing best practices in parole and probation. Some changes that there's no one going back on. I think what happened was the giant of police unions, the men and women in blue, jumped up and totally turned that one around. But I was in prison in the 70s, when in the 80s, when there was all these college programs and all this stuff going on, and there was a lot of stuff happening, and then there was taking away the Pell Grants, and it, like Carlos said, it shifted. But CJ tends to go really slowly. For the last 8, 9, or 10 years, it's been, I hate to say it, but an unholy coalition with the right on crime, smart on crime folks, right? That come at this stuff from a cost benefit analysis and appeal to the legislature with, look at all the money you're wasting over here, right? And they've been making incremental changes, right? In Texas, they closed like 8 prisons in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So no, I think what the reform that was it was aimed specifically at the cops and the way that they do their business, and I think that one of the ways that we Latino Justice have decided to do is we don't respond to everything, is we continue moving forward with what we're doing. And if people say something, and it's pretty easy to knock down the talking points of, oh, the rise in crime is attributed to police, less police. No, that's not. And, you can get sensible people on board.
Okay, well, I think you're more hopeful than I am. You can get sensible people on board. Aniba?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, and to your comment about the backlash, I think we should know now from history that every time that there's a movement towards equality, there's going to be a backlash, right? And we see the abolition of slavery, and then the Jim Crow laws, and we see the civil rights movements, and then we see how the carceral state become the fin of the state to make sure that we have a new type of slavery and a new type of separation in terms of racial. We see it with same-sex marriage, and then you see the backlash with all the trans bills and the criminalization of trans people. And what we have is what Jorge said, right? We need to keep fighting, and we need to keep working on those things, right? And we need to break down this narrative about our communities are not safe, right? They are safe, but they are policed more than other communities. So we need to start breaking those stereotypes and keep working in terms of, I wouldn't say reforms, but abolishing some of the barriers that we have structurally from the law.
Yeah, and I want to add that something that's also not in my bio that I don't really talk about too much is that I actually was also a policy advisor in the Diane Morales campaign for mayor for New York City. And as one of the policy advisors, I was at one point like one of the leads on her defund platform. For those who are unfamiliar, she was running on defunding the police NYPD budget by $6 million. The problem is we didn't have any connections to actual mass movement. And that's the problem. Change comes from the people. And a lot of folks who might be on the front lines of this criminal justice reform movement are also coming from not spaces of having experienced criminalization and incarceration directly. I think, like Jorge has said, his presence in the space is very rare. And as somebody who works in a big national nonprofit like the Vera Institute, not only can I say are there not very many Latinos who exist in those spaces, not just Vera, but generally in those spaces, less involved in those spaces if we believe that there can be change in that space, which is a whole separate conversation about the nonprofit industrial complex. But even those folks, we're not seeing folks who are formerly incarcerated. We're not seeing people who are living with and among and having loving, accountable relationships with those who are directly impacted. Folks in communities that are directly impacted by policing, by occupation of paramilitary forces in their communities, were the ones that showed out to vote for Eric Adams. And the reason is because there is very real fear that has not yet been addressed. And I'll close on this by saying Latinos were disproportionately killed or sick during COVID. Our families lost at least one person like entire income, but we know in communities it was a lot more than that. Our communities also are disproportionately criminalized. Jails are unhealthy, poisonous spaces where people with comorbidities that put them at risk of death of COVID are living. Jails and prisons, especially jails with their high churn rates, are incredibly fatal to communities. So in the state of Illinois, 1 out of 6 COVID infections were directly connected to the Cook County Jail. Directly connected to the Cook County Jail. At a time where you had community members protesting, not only Kim Foxx, who's the DA or the state's attorney in Chicago, but the jail's sheriff, because there was overcrowding. People were not getting released on bonds. They were being offered no bond at a time when we should have been decarcerating, and at a time where people were concerned about safety. People were piling up so much in the Cook County Jail that they were getting sued, and this was happening all across the country. And this happened to our communities. So we have people in our own communities with so much trauma, not only from the experience of being Latino in this community, they might have been immigrants, all of that trauma, yes. And on top of the fact that people were hungry, stressed out, and getting disproportionately impacted by the legal system itself. We have family members that come home being HIV positive because they were incarcerated, because maybe they were self-medicating while incarcerated because of the horrible conditions that they turned to heroin, which is available in jails because of prison guards, right? Like, let's be honest about the conditions in which jails and prisons and the interaction between our communities. Because it was Latinos and Black folks who died disproportionately more, and they will continue to do so, especially now when they're trying to say that we don't need a mask and all of those things. The amount of people that are in jail that are experiencing comorbidities, that are immunocompromised, is disproportionately high. So I think like our movements really need to be grounded in changing the material conditions of the people that are in jail, instead of some hypothetical North Star where we're making determinations over who we think deserves to get out via cash bail or no cash bail, versus who we think deserves to stay in because of determinations around dangerousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course the challenge is, how do we get our communities to sort of recognize that and vote for people who actually recognize that? I want to, sort of, one of the things that we haven't talked about, but I think it's really important, is to talk about gender and gender identity. So the film is titled Bad Hombres, but it also raises awareness of how Latinas are impacted by criminalization. We know that about 16% of incarcerated women in the U.S. are Latina, and we are also disproportionately represented in the child welfare system, aka the family policing system, both as children in foster care and as mothers trying to regain or retain custody of our children. Latinas are also targets of deportation. Can you talk about how Latinas are impacted by our justice systems, and specifically the juvenile justice system, the family policing system, the immigration system, the criminal justice system, anything else that I might have missed? And then I want us to talk about gender identity specifically as well. So I don't know if who wants to sort of start that question.
Do you want to start, Jack, or? No? So, I'm probably going to start with the part of the gender identity. And one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about criminalization is that there are many areas that might seem venial, right? And when you think about HIV criminalization, there are a lot of states that have HIV criminalization, and that affects our communities, especially men of color, right, which have a higher rate of being HIV positive for just not disclosing that they're HIV positive, right? And this gets into the records as a sex offenders. They go into jail for years for not even just saying that they were not saying that they were HIV positive, and there was no risk of transmission, right? And that is in the books. That is part of the criminalization. If you remember some years back, there was a movement from sex workers in Queens because police officers under the stop and freeze were stopping them, and if they have condoms, they use that as evidence of that they were going to commit prostitution. So we were putting their health at risk. We were putting them on jail, and sex workers, that's part of a great community in terms of trans. A lot of trans people lose their jobs, lose their family support, and then they turn to sex work, right? And we criminalize these people the same way criminalizing homelessness, right? Those old vagrancy statutes that exist criminalize young gay, lesbian, transgender, queer people that are leaving their houses because they don't have family support, which in the Latino community has a higher rate. And that is also part of criminalizing. So all of these peoples are coming into the criminal system just because of their gender identities in these ways, right? So that is part of that. And in terms of sex and gender, if you think about how women are criminalized under negligence statutes, right? When their children have accidents at their homes because the doctors think because they are Latinas or they are Black or they are women of color, they were being negligent, when the same happens to mothers that are white and they don't get prosecuted, right? And they don't get referred by the doctor. So all of those things are part of the policing state and how it affects gender.
Two things that I want to say before Jack, I give you an opportunity, and the rest of the panel to chime in. First, let's not. I think we should acknowledge that today is Trans Day of Visibility, and so that's why at Seton Hall we're wearing these pins. And so we did not plan, the panel on this day, but I think this is a really important issue to think about how trans and non-binary Latinx people are impacted by our justice systems. We definitely should be sort of thinking about that today. The second thing is to Anibal, to your point about how our system sort of presumes that people of color, women of color, are going to neglect or abuse their children. Well, the New Yorker has a great piece this week looking at how a white upper middle class mother abused her daughter for years, and the system just basically, in a sense, allowed her to get away with it. And that would never have happened if the mother had been of color and poor. Jack, do you want to share your thoughts with us? And then I don't know if Jorge and Carlos want to chime in.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn DA's office in the Domestic Violence Bureau. And while I was there, not only did I take on a docket of LGBTQ cases in particular, but I also, because I speak Spanish, I can't say I speak fluently, but I speak Spanish. I've been able to use it in my cases. I also worked with a lot of families and a lot of survivors who were Spanish, who only spoke Spanish. So I've also worked with a lot of immigrant moms, is a good way to put it, or just like young-ish, like women who are just like hustling, or maybe, young women who have experienced either trafficking or been statutorily raped and things like that. And so I'll start by just saying that I think some stats that I think are really important to really uplift, to understand the gravity of the situation, is that I love that Professor Lebron talked about the criminalization of homelessness. And so part of that is that something to keep in mind is that if you're a homeless youth, if you're LGBTQ, you're actually 7 to 8 times more likely to engage in survival sex than if you are a like non-LGBTQ homeless youth. So our people are being pushed out of their homes and criminalized pretty quickly. And so I appreciate, like, I think that we gave enough conversation to that. Something that I really wanted to bring out in talking about this question is that the United States response, an attempt to impact or address gender-based violence, is through one of its biggest legislation that was passed by the president that we have now, or authored, which was the 1994 crime bill, which include VAWA. VAWA is the Violence Against Women's Act. Almost 80%, and the percentage could be a little bit higher, but about 80% of the funds from the Violence Against Women's Act went to law enforcement. And the remaining 20% went to some like services. But even those services, a lot of ways to access those services required going through the criminal legal system. They require filing police reports. There are countless like women who had like police reports or didn't want to have to report, but they had no choice because they were trying to figure out a safer housing situation, right? And so the number one reason why most people stay in abusive relationships, if we really want to talk about gender-based violence, is lack of housing and lack of like alternative resources. If you're a white woman from the suburbs and you're trying to leave your husband, you can go stay at your friend's house who likely has another room for you, or you can like go move into an apartment because it's probably cheaper than how it is in the city and stuff. And I've seen that firsthand as someone who has lived in the suburbs. But when you're in the city and you think about the communities that are criminalized and the communities that have 911 called on them, because to be fair, not all, people like call 911, right? They're in much more precarious situations and are oftentimes not in the privilege of being able to leave a relationship, or they're in that relationship simply because of resources. And we don't really have that perspective, especially in the policies around gender-based violence, is really grounded in white carceral feminism that believes in protecting and believes that prosecution is important, because the reason why the person is experiencing abuse is because their abuser is completely choosing to treat them that way, which completely ignores the historical traumas that our own community members, our own partners experience and inherit generation after generation. Even within my own family, there are generations of inherited trauma, generations of toxic ways of relating to their community members and people that they love. And none of that is ever talked about or addressed. Our communities need resources, but our mothers, our queer sisters, brothers, selves are criminalized instead, because all we need are resources, but we've been displaced, we've been put into communities and controlled and then exploited through different sorts of labor markets, and that's the challenge. I think the policy of what a lot of the defund folks, the policy sort of like path that a lot of the defund folks are going down around, let's re-examine our budget and like reallocate resources, is really what we need. But we need some like mass movement, and we need to center the people who are most impacted by these harmful, by settler colonialism, by capitalism, by white supremacy. And those are our trans women of color, immigrants, and our homeless youth and things like that. Because otherwise, I was just seeing folks coming in as either survivors of experiencing trauma, as either a defendant who caused, who hurt their loved one, or as somebody, like I said, who's a victim of crime. And lastly, I think it's really important to uplift the amount of abuse that these particular communities also experience by the system itself, through the tools that the system decides to use. So if you talk to sex workers who are disproportionately trans women of color, especially the ones that Professor LeBron mentioned out in Queens, if you talk to them, they have been sexually abused and harassed by police. And when they're in custody, either in a jail or in prison, they're most likely to get put into solitary confinement. Like, these are our community members. And we all know about like the hypersexualization of Latinas, which I'll just close by saying nobody is immune from, even myself as a prosecutor. When I presented differently, I used to present as femme. When I presented differently, well, my experience has been a little different, but like when I presented differently, like cops did not hesitate to sexually harass me before work, on my way to the courthouse, outside the courthouse, from their police vans, from working with me on a case in my office. Like, this is nobody, it doesn't necessarily matter what our positionality or the respectability of whatever positions we think we get ourselves into. Working in solidarity with like our Latina sisters and queer folks is really the only way that we're going to be able to address any sort of gender-based violence that folks are experiencing.
Like look to the bottom. Yes.
If I can add something to what Jack is saying, and it's again to show that divide between white feminism and feminism coming from women of color. If you think about the experience of women in jail, so our communities, our fellow sisters, Latinas, are getting sterilized in prisons, right? And that's something that is not being talked about that much. The same in detention centers, in immigration detention centers, which are also part of the police power, and they have forced sterilizations for these women. So that is taking not only talking about what Jack said, the sexual violence that they experience in terms of rape and sexual aggression, but also not having power over their bodies and decisions. And it's made in a way that is racialized also in the prison system.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that that's something that most of us are just not aware of, or the media hasn't done enough to sort of increase awareness. We have some questions, and so I think it's important for us to look at some of the questions from the audience, and then we'll see where we are in a few minutes. So what legislative changes do you all recommend to prevent future constitutional violations, like the zero tolerance policy of forced separations, are prevented in the future? And this is from Trish Laureano. Thank you, Trish, for that question. So I don't know if Jorge and Carlos, you've been a little quiet for a few minutes, so maybe if one of you wants to take this one to start us off.
This was sort of beyond. This was beyond my pay grade, so I'm going to pass on this myself.
I'm not exactly sure what zero tolerance of forced separations is, to be honest. But when it comes to legislative changes, in general, right? It's a hard time to do that. It's just a hard time to do that. Constitutional stuff you're talking about is probably on a federal level, right? So the feds, you might have an easier time shooting something to than you might on a state level. I know we did not have one significant bill addressing any sort of CJ issues or immigration issues that made it out of the government. I had one bill that made it to the governor's desk on parole, and it got cut down. It's just not the time. I guess it depends on the state you're in or whatever. I think that. Plus, whatever gets done legislatively can be undone legislatively next session. I'm more in favor of doing stuff like we're all fighting Operation Lone Star here in Texas, right? Which is the criminalization of immigrants by Governor Abbott as a way to he started to follow 45's template, and we have a small but growing force of advocates that are learning how to navigate. For a long time, people talk of crimmigration as if they're two separate issues, as if immigration organizers and the CJ organizers just bounce every now and then and meet, like ships passing in the night, like they're two separate things. Well, they're not. It's the criminalization of bodies, and they're putting them in jail. The person turning the key doesn't care what you do to get there. But for a long time, those organizers, those fields haven't really worked in concert much. They're doing that a lot here in Texas now. So I think when it comes to grand issues or issues on a grander scale, legislative stuff can be undone, as you can see, or it can be challenged, or it can go to the Supreme Court and it get kicked back. But if you change people's actions and behavior and attitudes and beliefs and values on a fundamental grassroots level, I think you have a better chance of making those type of, or accepting this type of stuff, or supporting people who pass zero tolerance stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't know if also Trish was talking about zero tolerance in schools, like with that and the a school to prison pipeline, right? And that's a very difficult question because district has so much power to create those policies and whether they collaborate with the police, right? So it's about really grassroots work that has to be done in the school to educate the parents, right? And that also require, and I think Jack touches upon this, uh, the need to have people that are able to communicate with our community, have attorneys that can speak Spanish, so that, and have organizers that can speak Spanish to all the components of the community so that they can actually organize and move reform and changes and avoid these policies in school, which turn out later to have people that are young people going to jail for things that happens in school that if we were in a white community we will be managed very differently in that way. And also the importance, and I think Jorge will talk more about this later, in terms of voting rights for people that have been convicted and voting rights for people that are in prison so that they can also have political power. So, and that we can make changes, right? Because that's a huge block of people, and part of the disenfranchisement that happens, right, to Black communities and Latino communities is putting people into jail so that they cannot vote.
I mean, one of the things, I mean, when you mentioned the school to prison pipeline, it really reminded me of, you know, how the criminalization of the Latinx community, you know, starts, you know, so early. And the film raised awareness of how young people are profiled, you know, through these gang injunctions and in other ways. But, you know, how do stereotypes of criminality in the Latinx community impact young people, you know, in particular today? And, you know, how do these stereotypes contribute to the school to prison pipeline? I mean, both for Latinas and Latinos and gender non-binary individuals. And so, you know, how do communities organize to put an end to the stereotyping and profiling, especially in areas like New York and New Jersey, where, you know, MetroLALSA is obviously located, where young Latinx people are so overrepresented in our juvenile justice system?
I think we have to just defund the police, right? We don't need police in schools. We don't need police departments. We need resources that we can work together to keep ourselves safe. There are so many programs all across the country that are working with youth, that work amongst community members, engaging in transformative justice, restorative justice, mediation, and creating safe spaces for community members to resolve conflicts and keep each other safe. Mutual aid networks. The changes have to be hyper local and just based in real authentic relationship between folks. And what we should be demanding from our governments, I think, are just resources and trust. Because otherwise we have the police are the ones that are making decisions about what children should be included in gang databases. So, you know, this is a good opportunity to just say that there is a relationship between DOE and, you know, the NYPD, where we have children are getting put into a gang database and being labeled as gang members simply because you have police officers going on their Facebook pages or going on their Twitter pages or whatever other social media Gen Z is using and interpreting their conduct as criminal. So if you wear certain colors, if you are hanging out with certain kids, if you are, you know, from a certain area, if you're making certain like hand gestures, you're automatically going to be deemed a possibly part of like a gang. They'll put you in the gang database. You'll get stopped by police. You'll get picked up, and then you'll get sent over to, if they don't press any charges. If they don't press any charges, they're bringing you in, they're talking to you, they're trying to get your DNA, putting it into their system, and then letting you get out in a hostile community far away from where you're actually from. So now that community that you're put in, where people don't even know you, are now seeing you suspiciously, and now you're physically unsafe. If they are pressing charges, then they're sending it over to the prosecutor's office, telling prosecutors, oh, this person is a gang member, don't offer them a plea at arraignment. And these kids are being offered, and I say kids, young people, teenagers, we're talking about 16, 17, 18, and I know that there's been raise the age legislation as an attempt to address this, but there are so many exceptions, especially for certain felonies, that the changes aren't really tackling the disproportionality in the way that it needs to.
And when you said, I mean, yes, raise the age, there has been that push, but I'm remembering, going to Spofford and seeing children as young as 10 years old, so it's not just the 15, 16-year-olds, but a lot of times it's much younger.
Yeah, and part of what Jack is saying, right? Defunding the police, and it means putting resources, but also putting people that can identify with this community. So if you go to inner city schools, you see that there's a lot of white professors that don't have the contact, and the solution that they have is to refer this to the police, right? Whereas if you have Latino professors, Latinas professors, Latinos teachers, Latinx in the classrooms, that will change the dynamics of it, right? And I want to emphasize this again because of what Jack was saying. When they go into those process, not having an attorney that can speak Spanish to those parents, right, and not able to communicate effectively with them is crucial. So part of the work is also to diversify our legal community, right, and make sure that we have Latinx attorneys that can speak to the clients, right? And I mean, we have the best example with the Central Park 5, right? And we remember like all the things that happened there and how the police coerce these teenagers into these confessions, right? And once they have said that, there's no way of backing that back, right? There's no way to take that away. So those are things that we need to work on.
I mean, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about defund the police and other types of reforms that if we can call it that. I'm putting that in air quotes. But before we explore that, I did want. I mean, I don't know if everyone has a clear understanding of some of the collateral consequences of these different justice systems. And of course, I'm putting justice in air quotes because a lot of people would say that they're injustice systems. And so the film addresses some of the challenges that are faced by people who are incarcerated at some point, but are now trying to reintegrate after serving a prison sentence. And so can you just tell us about some of the collateral consequences that are faced by people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, who were incarcerated or who have been on probation? And here I'm thinking, I mean, I think you've given a sort of a sense of a few of them, like housing, employment, voting, deportation, consequences that maybe we don't think about when we're thinking about prison. So what are some of those collateral consequences? I mean,
I'll just take a quick stab at that, and my answer is going to be extremely personal and anecdotal, in that I have a great nephew, who was stopped under rather questionable circumstances in response to police, and ended up being put in prison for 366 days in order to make certain that he completed the year in order to be able to be charged with a felony. He model kid in prison, got out, and as the consequences that he suffered is in terms of employment and education. He difficulties in terms of finding a job, difficulties in terms of being able to go to school, get specific scholarships and the like. So, and he's lived with that for a good 10 years now, just in all that time trying to rehabilitate for a wrong decision or wrong consequence at a bad time. I mean, these consequences are real and they exist and they continue. That's one anecdotal experience. Jorge might be able to speak to more in that regard.
Yeah, well, I think you named them. I mean, employment, housing, loans from banks, pretty well anything that's official and that needs the quote unquote imprimatur of an official agency, right? In order to gain access. I'm lucky in that the two things that I do well, I guess, is organize people who've been incarcerated and write poetry. Neither one of those have a bar against people who have criminal histories, so I've been able to make it in the world. But yeah, I'm looking to get an RV because I can't rent a house and I've been out 14 years,
and have a good job and whatever, and they're just not going to do it, especially in a place like Austin. And what's really bad though is that more than anything is the prison takes advantage of your non-awareness of those collateral consequences sometimes. For example, and this impacts the Latinx population a lot, or did when I was down. Guards do three things in Texas prisons, right? They hand out mail, they turn the keys, and they count. Everything else is done by people who are incarcerated, up to plumbing and maintenance and all that stuff. Well, there's an in-prison school district whose job is to train individuals to perform some of the functions, right, of some of the more high-level vocational things. And so they would train people. They would train a lot of Latinx to do plumbing and electrical work, right? And they would be inside 9, 10, 12 years. Those people would get out, and they then found out that they couldn't get their
You're muted, Jorge.
Oh yeah, well I did that. I'm screwed. I won't have to move here because it's a little loud in here.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. But anyway, I can talk and move. I can same time. But yeah, so what I'm saying was it. So they were inside picking up the skills, right, to do something, and they would get out in the free world, and they couldn't do electrical work or plumbing work because they had to get license from the state. So of course, the lady asked questions earlier about legislative stuff. That specifically is stuff that was addressed and fixed legislatively by going to the Texas Department of Licensing and Registration and having them. Okay, well maybe they can't work in residential housing, but they can work in new housing, right? So we fixed it so that people could work, and this is having a huge impact on people who were getting trained on the inside, right, to do specific functions that in their family was prestige. Mi tío es plomero, so they were getting trained to do that. And they would get out and they couldn't, and they couldn't practice that here. So yeah, but it's stuff like employment. I mean, and we all know that, you go in and you say that you have a criminal history, more often than that's going to get thrown in the trash. They're not even going to say anything to you. I went to enroll at Samuel State University years back and was given an interview by the Dean of Student Affairs and the Chief of Campus Police, and I doubt that that's par for the course for every student who is transferred to Samuel State University. Yeah, so I tend to walk through the world not really caring, doing what it is that I want to do, and not really, if they don't let me do something, then I move on to something else, right? But yeah, there's women have it, I think, a hell of a lot harder, because women get their kids taken from them. Women get a lot of things done, right? Their status as a mother, right? That gets, in many ways, we talked about the sanctity of that, but and in our community, if a woman goes to prison, a lot of times she can forget it. Her kids are gone, and the community is not going to rise up for her. Say, okay, you messed up, you made a mistake. So those are collateral consequences that aren't necessarily codified in statute, right? But those are things that our community, right, places on community members.
Mm-hmm. Can we just, I guess a lot of people in the audience may not be aware of, what happens to someone's voting rights or what happens in terms of public housing. Can you talk a little bit, Jack or Aniva, a little bit about, what that is, what actually happens in those cases potentially?
I'll just speak from my experience as a prosecutor. We pit family members, the system pits family members against each other, because if you live in public housing and you got yourself, then the lease is in your name, that's a really important resource for the family because it can be inherited. And it's very hard to get public housing with your, name on the lease and everything like that. And if you have somebody that's coming out, like, they can't stay with you. you can't offer. There are people that are barred. Yeah. And I don't want to talk I'm not talking just about, okay, somebody's coming out, maybe they did a couple years and have a felony. It spirals because it's also people who have been placed on the sex offender registry. They're on the streets and they're street homeless because they can't even get into a shelter. And then, when we think about trans women of color, they can't get trans immigrant women can't get into, New York City shelters, or if they do, they're very unsafe conditions and oftentimes prefer to live outside the shelter. So that the housing, the bar on housing is really just particularly horrible, I think, the way it separates communities.
Go ahead.
Yes, it also, I mean, it also affects like if people want to get an education, like loan applications for that. It also have some collateral effects in terms of deportation, right? Depending the crime that you commit, you can get deported. That means that some of elderly members of the community might be left alone because they have a child who take care of them. First, they couldn't come, as Jack was saying, because they are not allowed to stay because of public housing and rules, but also they disappear of the country, right? They're no longer able to come and take care of the elders. So that's also another issue that comes into these cases.
So to wrap this up, our last question. It's clear from the film that our system of justice is not working. And many scholars, many advocates have said we don't have a criminal justice system, but rather we have a criminal injustice system. And that the same is true of our immigration system, our family policing system, juvenile justice, and so forth. And so these scholars and advocates, they don't believe that these systems or institutions can be fixed or reformed, but instead they argue for abolition. That we must abolish prisons, we must abolish immigration detention centers, we must abolish the family policing system. Are these abolitionists onto something? I mean, can our system be fixed, or are the cracks so deep that we just need to start over?
Since this is the last question, I'm gonna go very shortly. I just want to say, Solange, your voice is just so melodic. It's just incredible. Thank you. It's just so smooth.
Thank you.
And asking a hard question. Yeah, I mean, I'm a hardcore abolitionist, and I'm one of those that says open them up tomorrow. But I also know that the system, the way it is, most would be back within a month. I think that it's not so much abolish prisons. If prison is ultimately a separation of someone for temporarily from society, abolitionists don't say we agree that we have to separate them from society. You abolish prisons that are cages that are meant to dehumanize and meant as punishment. You abolish that system, right? Our system is based on punishment, and our system is based on punishing and dehumanizing and separating certain classes of individuals so that the white moneyed classes can continue to profit. That's what our system is based on. So yeah, that's got to go. But Jack said something earlier about defunding the police. I don't think it's so much about defunding the police. It's put the money where it's supposed to be in the communities. And then since the cops got all the money, yeah, okay, then let's go after them. But yeah, but we need to build something better. We need to let our imagination run free, right? Before we just talk about let's close all the cages. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, the only way we need to talk about this is abolishing this police state, because when we think about reform, every time that there's a reform to the criminal system, what we see is that we have more prison, more people in prison, more people being policed, and the same happens with all these other facets that we're talking in education, in the family service system, in the welfare system, in all of these other spheres, right? So the only way that we can do this, and especially because this is a system that was created for marginalizing people, it was created for enslaving people, for getting profit out of people, for dehumanizing people. So we cannot reform something that in its inception was created to do the work, because at the end it will do the work, right? So we need to reimagine another system in which we can attend to the needs of the communities. We can change the systemic barriers that are there, right? And tackle the problems that are at the bottom of our society.
Thank you.
I would add that I think that the beauty of our community is that we can bring an internationalist perspective to this conversation and really draw on solidarity. Like, we are an international community, if you think about it, right? Latinos are international, our experience is international, and we've been impacted by American foreign policy that controls the flow of extractive economies, wars, regime changes. All of these things are pretty connected. Biden just expanded the Pentagon budget. He just gave a whole bunch of money to police, maybe only 100 million to violence interrupters. Meanwhile, we have rising cost inflation, all this other stuff happening. And so, I think not only do we have to think about abolition, but we have to think about abolition as a global project in terms of reorienting our relationship between each other and with the land. And one thing that we haven't necessarily brought up, but I think is really important to remember, is that the way the Latinos have been treated in this country is very similar, if not overlaps, with the history of how Native people and genocide has happened in this country. Right. So we have lynchings, the police, and the cowboy, Expansion West, all of that were policies aimed to contain and exploit and extract resources from Native people who were also Mexicanos, who were also, other, South American people, Puerto Ricans, were native to our land, yet all of us are here because of American extractive economies and militarism. So I think that if we really, for me, criminal justice reform, criminal justice change is really about demilitarization and changing our relationship with others so that we can hold each other accountable instead of outsourcing what we like to call accountability, outsourcing our dealing with conflict to a criminal legal system, because that's what it wants us to do. And within our own families, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, to talk about how we have healthy relationships that center our traumas, center our needs, so that we can be healthier with each other. We don't necessarily have to call the cops. If we develop deep relationships with our neighbors and ways of having vulnerable conversations with each other about how our conduct, whether we intend it to be harmful or not, impacts other people, and how we hold each other accountable to that, in the same way in which we need to be in healthy relationship with other countries and other Native folks in other spaces, like in Palestine, like in the Philippines, so on and so forth.
So this has been an incredibly powerful conversation. Before we close, I wanted to announce our raffle winners, Missy Rosol and Savannah Castaneda. So congratulations. You will be getting an email from Devin Weber with your prizes. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And if you have any other questions, we are all happy to hear from you. I'm sure you can get our emails quite easily. So thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.